Thank you for inviting me to your Research to Education Practice Conference here in Kazakhstan. These are difficult times for education, not just in Kazakhstan, but everywhere around the world. 1.5 billion young people have been locked out of the schools. And the one thing they take away from this experience is that learning is not a place, but an activity. And that education and technology must work better together in the future. Technology has become the lifeline for education, but it hasn't addressed the many social functions of schools. We've also seen how access, use, but also the quality of online educational resources have often amplified existing inequalities in education. Accreditation has been put at stake. We do no longer know how to conduct reliable exams in a social distancing environment. There have also been huge needs for just-in-time professional development, keeping up as a teacher with the rapid pace of technological development. At the very same time, there have been lots of really innovative developments in many countries, including Kazakhstan. Social innovation, technological innovation. But think about this in a little bit of a longer time frame. Between the year 2000 and 2018, so much has happened in the world of technology, in our societies. In the year 2000, when we conducted our first PISA assessment in reading literacy, reading was still a very different construct. It was about, accessing and processing predefined texts, reading books. And when you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia. You can trust the answer to be true. Today, in the year 2020, well, when you don't know the answer to a question, you look it up on Google or Weibo, and you get 10,000 answers to your question. And nobody tells you what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. It's about constructing knowledge. A very different skill set, much harder to teach, much harder to learn. If you think about 2003, was the start of, many technological developments. 2007, the year the iPhone was invented. 2009, 10, social media came into play. 2012, robotics, cloud computing, biogenetics. 2015, artificial intelligence emerging. Huge developments in science and technology. And at the same time, when we look at the PISA outcomes, they haven't really changed over that period. No. Basically, young people performed in 2018 more or less how they performed in the year 2000. And what you can also see that only on average across the industrialized world, the OECD countries, less than 1 in 10 young people could reliably distinguish between a fact and opinion when those information were embodied in a more complex environment. Now you can say, well, that's better than 7% in the year 2000. But once again, think how fast this world has changed. Now, navigating ambiguity, managing complexity, triangulating different sources of information is a necessity, no longer a nice to have. Well, but we've also seen some countries, evolving very fast. You can look at the 4 regions in China for which we have data. They now top the world. Singapore has moved from good to great. Estonia in Europe, one of the poorer countries in Europe. It's not about wealth, actually moving to the frontier. Or you can look to Portugal, Southern Europe. You can look to Poland. Some countries have been able to continue to advance their education system. At the lower end of the performance spectrum, you can look to Peru, or you can look to Albania. You can also look to big countries like Brazil or Turkey. They haven't progressed as impressively as others, but they have been able to get a lot more young people into school. If you think about Turkey in 2003, there were just 36% of 15-year-olds covered by PISA. In the year 2018, it was 73%, and yet performance improved, which shows us that quality and access are not, opposing ends of policy objectives. Or you can look to Sweden. a country that used to be at the top of international comparisons and declined and declined. But in 2010-11, they caught the ball, turned things around, and again, moved to a path of improvement, which shows us actually, if we, take education seriously, we can change things, even in the most difficult circumstances. And that gets us to the league tables where we are today. You can find Kazakhstan also with still a lot of room for education improvement, despite the many good things that have happened in the country. So the current challenges, the challenges of the pandemic, come at a time where still a lot of improvement in education is needed. And it's not just about, adding more time to education. Of course, one of the concerns people have in this pandemic is that learning time is being diminished. But the quantity of learning time is not a great predictor for outcomes. Look here how vast this learning time varies. In blue, I've marked the time that students spend learning in school per week, and in yellow, the time they spend learning out of school. You can look at the United Arab Emirates, number 1 in terms of the quantity of learning time. Well, you look to the left side of the chart, Finland, a little bit more than half of the learning time in the UAE. But when you look at, productivity, learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see in a country like Finland or Germany or Switzerland or Sweden, students learn a lot in very little time. Whereas in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn comparatively little. So it's not about just volume. Learning outcomes are always the product of the quantity of learning time and the quality with which we use that student learning time, the quality of teaching, the quality of the learning environment. So that's really at stake. That's so important, particularly in the context of this pandemic. Now, I told you, learning time and maybe money are not that great predictor for outcomes, but here is one that is actually amazingly predictive. And that's basically the growth mindset that students have on the horizontal axis. You can see where students, had a strong growth mindset, where they believed that they own their success, where learning is a product of hard work, not talent, not, the genes that I've got. You can see Estonia, number 1 in the OECD area on PISA, number 1 in growth mindset. Indonesia, a long way to go on both. And you can see Kazakhstan also is something that, has to improve outcomes. But that mindset of young people, that learning is not about where I come from, but learning is about what I invest, how hard I try, and how well my teachers support me. That's really, I think, the key in the world today. And think about it. It's not just about cognitive outcomes. We can see that students with a stronger growth mindset were also more motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. Now, think about this. If you want your young people to be creative, imaginative, they'll have to experiment. If they experiment, they'll take risks. If they take risks, they'll make mistakes. If your education system doesn't tolerate mistakes and doesn't help students to learn from and with mistakes, probably they will not develop that growth mindset that is so crucial. Students with a stronger growth mindset were better able to establish more ambitious learning goals and saw greater value in school. And again, in this context of the pandemic, where students have to often learn remotely, take responsibility for their learning, set their own learning goals, monitor their learning progress, mindset is as important as the kind of cognitive prerequisites that we often consider in the field of education. It's not just about technology, it's very much about the attitude and expectation for learning. Think about, again, technology. About a decade ago, we got those little devices into our hands, and soon after, the real world and the virtual world began to integrate, and everybody got connected. That's happened in just a few years of time, and everybody knows this. We are becoming dependent on technology from very young ages onwards. If you look to the PISA results, you can see half of 15-year-old boys and girls say, I feel really bad if I'm not connected. Being part of the digital world has become like breathing air, like drinking water. So we must make this work better in the education environment. And what we also know is that technology can significantly amplify good education. It can scale the work of teachers. But it doesn't replace poor teaching. Technology, artificial intelligence is a great accelerator. It's a great amplifier. It amplifies good ideas in good educational practice in the same way in which it amplifies bad ideas and bad educational practice. So it really depends on the people using those kinds of technologies. Now, the first thing that our data show is that market capitalization in education is very, very limited compared, for example, with the health sector, where there is a huge health industry. A very, very different kind of role of the outside world, the ecosystem around the services. In education, we don't yet know that. Also, the investment in technology is still very limited in the field of education. It's in its infancy. It's expected to grow by 2025. We expect a lot more resources to be invested in education and technology. But even if you look at this in relative terms, yeah, it might double, but it's not going to be anywhere near where we see that in other sectors of our society. Where is the investment going in education and technology? Augmented reality, virtual reality, the big part of this. And that's not difficult to understand. Why would you want to listen to the results of an experiment, shared by a teacher, if you can actually do that experiment as a student in a virtual laboratory? So those kinds of virtual reality, augmented reality environments have become quite powerful in the field of education. Artificial intelligence as well. Artificial intelligence now allow us to observe how different students learn differently and adapt the learning environment to the needs of individual students. A lot of potential for the future. Robotics, blockchain. Let's have a look at some of this technology in a little bit more detail. The first thing that we know technology can do really well, if combined with great teachers, is to better personalize learning. While you study a problem on the computer can study you, and actually you see the kind of problems that get you interested in, that you find boring, where you're good at, where you still have to catch up, and so on. Technology can actually help teachers to make learning more granular, more adaptive, more personal, provide individual feedback. Very, very important. Technology has revolutionized assessment and evaluation. In the past, we used to fill out bubble sheets, check the right answer that the teacher thought was right before. Now, actually, you can work in a virtual environment, solve real world problems, and the computer will score your stuff. You can use adaptive assessments that actually adapt to the ability of young people. That's something that we do in PISA now as well. Now, if you are having a hard time with the first task, we'll make that problem a little bit easier for you so that it actually adapts to your personal abilities. You can do hands-on assessments in vocational settings. We can actually also grade open-ended answers from students, where they write an essay and the computer can actually pretty well already score that in a quite reliable way. The world of testing and the world of learning used to be separate. Some teachers would think, well, testing takes time away from learning. Now we can bring those two worlds together to integrate the world of learning, to integrate with the world of assessment. While students learn, they can get personalized feedback. Teachers can see how different students learn differently. That's the future of assessment through technology. Learning analytics. Once again, sensors in the classroom can tell us, how different students learn differently and then adapt that learning to their individual needs. They can help teachers to decide, when it's time to move on to a new activity. Am I losing the attention of my students? Are they really engaged in what I'm just doing with them? How should I best structure my, instruction time? Is the lecture the best format, a small group discussion, assessment? Technology can help teachers making those kinds of judgments. Even when students learn at home, technology can be very powerful in this. Robots, that's something that's probably more in its infancy. We can see lots of good examples. I've actually seen that in Kazakhstan as well, where students were doing computer programming and then the robots were executing their programs. But even a step further, we see the emergence of social robots that take on the roles of teacher aides, tutors, peers, sometimes of the students themselves. And then last but not least, blockchain technology. That's something that we don't see so many examples yet, but I would think in the future they will be very, very different. One of the big problems that we have in exams today is that they're very lumpy. You study for many years and then they do a test and that's your exam, and that counts for a lot of years in your life, maybe for all your life. That's not very future oriented because it will also always capture your past, not your present. In the future, probably we're going to have many more assessments in our lives, and blockchain technology will verify and validate those kinds of micro-credentials and always give us a reliable picture of what we can do today rather than where we have studied once in our past. The development of digital credentials, secure and trustworthy transfer of academic records, all of that will soon be a reality, or is already becoming a reality. So this is just an illustration of the role that technology can play well beyond the pandemic. We shouldn't get too distracted with technology during this pandemic, filling learning gaps. That's of course very important. But every development that we put in place today should be a little stone, a little element of the education of the future. But what I don't want to deny is that the COVID pandemic dramatically accelerates those technological developments. That's very clear. None of what we see would have been predicted. The kind of technical change that we have seen in education, also the use of technology by teachers, would have been something that we predicted, a year or 2 years ago. Look at this. When we surveyed the OECD countries in May, only about 22% of the countries thought that we're going to go back to where we came from. A small minority of countries see the past as the future. Hybrid learning. Who talked about hybrid learning a year ago? Now you can see over 50% of the countries see hybrid learning as the new normal. And hybrid learning means not, I teach once in a digital world and once in a real setting. No, it means actually I adapt different learning environments for different students. Students learn in both worlds, in the real world, in the on-site world, in the online world. And I have a teacher, I have to combine and integrate those learning experiences in meaningful ways. A hugely challenging task. But it also means that learning can now extend beyond the classrooms. It can be ubiquitous, available everywhere. Some of that is necessitated, when students come back to schooling now. Basically, not all students can come at the same time because social distancing requirements will mean that there are capacity constraints. We have to deal with this. And that means, technology will have to compensate for what we can do on site, putting huge demands on teachers to design those kinds of innovative learning environments. What we could also see during the pandemic, that existing online instructional resources were used almost everywhere, in Kazakhstan, everywhere in the world. But look at the orange bar. Most of this was basically technology serving teachers. Online instruction was largely created by teachers and mediated by technology. This is not yet, independent platforms providing learning. No, it's teachers teaching through Zoom, through Skype, through Teams, through other kind of media. That's a very important point. It shows again how technology will amplify the work of good teachers, but not replace teachers. Also, we have seen instructional textbooks, packages, educational television, radio playing very important roles in some ways, reaching out to students in remote areas, but also the young students. Students in primary school. Online learning is not that effective. Television can play a very important role, and we should not overlook that kind of role. But, technology is only as good as it's actually being deployed. And we can see huge variation across countries on this. This is the share of teachers who typically or often let their students use technology for projects or classwork. And you can see in Kazakhstan, that's quite good. It's about 2/3 of teachers now. More than on average in the OECD countries. Look at the end of the spectrum, Japan, a high-tech country, but teachers are not yet comfortable with using technology. Huge variability in the take-up of technology in 2018 in the classroom. But, there's also been a lot of progress. If you compare the data from 2018 with 2013, you can see in countries like, Sweden or Romania or Israel or Finland or Croatia, the share of teachers using technology frequently has actually doubled or more than doubled in a 5-year period. So you can see many countries are well on their way to actually integrate the capacity of teachers to use technology. So let's move from the technology as a tool to what kind of knowledge and skills do we need for the world of tomorrow, a technology, driven world. Some people call this all a race between technology and education. Basically, if you look before the great industrial revolution, neither technology nor education played a big role for the vast majority of people. But then came the first industrial revolution, moving technology ahead of people. And you can see it caused a huge amount of social pain because people were not ready for it. They were not prepared for the industrial world. But, that's also the time when universal public schooling was invented, making people compliant with the ideas, the norms of the industrial society. And that generated, a huge amount of prosperity. But since then, we haven't really changed our model of schooling very much. And now we face a digital revolution. Now, once again, technology is racing ahead of the knowledge and skills of people and causing such, again, social pain. You can see students, leaving universities with expensive degrees, not being able to find a good job. And at the very same time, basically employers tell you they cannot find the people with the skills they need. That gap between what education provides and what young people need is, again, causing huge amount of social pain. So the question is, how do we move, the skills of people, again, ahead of the technologies of our times? Of course, knowledge is expanding exponentially, and it's filled with so many facets and ideas. There's so many things you could be teaching every day. And it always comes with people. That's very important. Learning is not a transactional phenomenon. Learning is always a relational phenomenon. Now, the subjects, that you like most in primary school had probably little to do with the intrinsic nature of the subject and a lot more to do with whether the teacher who you had, had a passion for the subject they taught, whether they understood your own passions, your dreams, your aspirations, and were able to support them in effective ways. That relational aspect is very important. And compared to that, the world of the curriculum in the school is very small. And they try to sort of cram everything into this little box. And in this pandemic, where this box has become even smaller, we struggle even more to push everything inside this little box. But what typically happens is that what arrives in the box are very shallow shadows of themselves. If you ask young primary grade students in Kazakhstan about science, they all love science. Science is about inquiry. It's about experimenting. It's about understanding nature, understanding the idea of cause and effect. If you ask students in Kazakhstan at the age of 15 years about science, many, find it a boring school subject. Formulas and equations that have nothing to do with the nature of science, the ideas of scientific inquiry. And again, we put more and more and more and more things into this little box. What we often forget is, what makes us different. The realm of the human knowledge, the realm of ethics and judgment, the realm of political and civic life, building social capital, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, and design, and so on. In these times of artificial intelligence, we need to think harder about this. The industrial age, taught us, how to educate second-class robots. People who are very good to repeat what we tell them. In the time of artificial intelligence, we need to think much harder what makes us human. And at the heart of this is what we call student agency. Students not being passive consumers of learning, but being able to structure their learning, to navigate ambiguity, to take responsibility. That is so important. That is the key for being successful in the pandemic. When students sit at home, have to learn over a week's time, well, you as a teacher do not control that time. It's the students themselves that need to feel that level of agency and ownership and passion for what they learn. And again, hopefully that's going to be one of the elements that remains after this pandemic. And learning itself, has become not, just learning something or teaching something, but about, developing a reliable compass and the tools to navigate with confidence through this increasingly volatile, complex, ambiguous world. Of course, knowledge will always remain important. But disciplinary knowledge, the surface, will become less important. It changes very rapidly. What is much more important, whether students understand the ideas and the nature of a discipline. Not just, what you know in physics and chemistry, but can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? Can you think like a mathematician? Mathematics is not about formulas and equations. We spend a lot of time to teach students to calculate an exponential function. Well, but we need to invest more in helping them understand the ideas and the nature of an exponential function. If we were better at that, we would have sent, 10,000 doctors to fight the corona pandemic, not 100 at the beginning. The exponential function as an idea is very far from human experiences. Time is linear, space is linear. We're very comfortable in the real world. Well, the mathematical world can help us understand different ideas, different worlds. That's really what it means to think like a mathematician. Or history. History is not about names and places. History is about understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changes. We see that all around us. What does it mean for the time in which we live today? Those are the big questions of knowledge. If young people master the ideas of the disciplines, they can construct their own world around them. They can accumulate knowledge when they need it. That's very important. Also, the capacity to think across the boundaries of subject matter disciplines. Innovation today is always about, connecting the dots where the next big idea is going to come from. And of course, knowledge is just the start. The world no longer rewards people just for what they know. Google knows everything. The world rewards people for what they can do with what they know. Well, skills. And often we think about cognitive skills like creativity and critical thinking. And yes, they're very important. But perhaps even more important nowadays are social and emotional skills. Curiosity, empathy, courage, leadership. Very, very hard to develop, but very, very important. They should not be considered as byproducts. And sometimes they are not taught in immersive learning environments. And they make the role of the teacher so much more important. Basically, those kinds of dispositions, ideas, attitudes are developed in interaction with people. Teachers who are not just good instructors, but who are also good mentors, good coaches, good designers, good facilitators of educational processes. This is again, why technology can support good teaching, but it cannot replace the idea of teaching. So if you ask me, what are the most transformative competencies in the post-pandemic world? Well, of course, it's about creating new value, imagination. It's about, building something of intrinsic positive worth. It's also about, reconciling tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white, navigating ambiguity, managing complexity, walking yourself through difficult constraints. That's important. And then taking responsibility, being able to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources to do something. That's become really the key. Now, that's the theory. That's the aspiration. But look again at the results from Thales, and you can see we're still quite far away from this, even before the pandemic. Teachers are quite comfortable when it comes to clarity of instruction. I explain to students what I expect them to learn. 90% of teachers say that that's basically what very common in their class. I explain how new and old topics are related. Over 80%. I set goals at the beginning of instruction. But when you look to cognitive activation, I give tasks that require students to think critically. Less than 60%. I have students work in small groups to come up with a solution, just 50%. I let students solve complex tasks, less than 50%. I present tasks for which there is no obvious solution, just 1/3. And I give students projects that require at least 1 week to complete. Very rare. And that shows us, the kind of teaching practices, the kind of pedagogies that have become so crucially important in this pandemic, where students need to take so much more ownership over their learning practices. They're still quite rare. So on the one hand, technological innovation is racing ahead, has done, huge jumps over the last few months and will continue to do so. But we may need to do the same in the field of pedagogy, helping teachers to develop the kind of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values, the new pedagogies. And that means, it's not about, just studying longer in university as a teacher. It's about, the school becoming a place where not just students learn, but where everybody learns, where students learn, teachers learn, parents learn, where there is an environment in which we see tomorrow will be different from today. And I believe actually Kazakhstan is on a good way of doing this. Kazakhstan has invested a lot in making education more open, more creative, more flexible, more adaptive in the field of technology. Kazakhstan has equipped schools, many schools already, with a quite good infrastructure. But there's a lot more to be done to educate young people for their future, not our past. Thank you very much.